record. Great, so welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Derek Lemoine. He's a professor of economics at the University of Arizona, also a research associate at NBER. I've actually had the privilege of getting to see Derek's research from the time he was a graduate student when he was doing very cool work on tipping points in climate change models. I think that paper ended up in AJ Policy or something like that. Anyway, he's at this point a very well-known researcher in the area of the economics of climate change who works in applied theory, typically using numerical models and integrated assessment models to explore various topics, various issues that arise. An example of that kind of work, a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, he had an AER paper that looked at interactions between sort of inertia in the climate system and the implications of that for optimal climate policy. He also has an interesting tie to CSU. His brother was a graduate student at CSU up until a couple years ago. So I had the chance to have lunch with him a while back. I forget, he was in chemistry or somewhere in the natural sciences. What department was he in?
Ecology. I don't know exactly what the department's called there, but ecology, evolutionary biology, something like
Warren, yeah, I think he was in the Warren School. That's right. Yeah, so anyway, it's a bummer we can't have you out, Derek, but really appreciate your taking the time to meet with us. Derek just had a baby a few months ago. He was 5 months ago, I guess. He was going to present in the fall and had to back out. So really great to have you here. So looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Terry, and thanks for having me out for the nice intro. So I've learned more about hyperbolic discounting from Terry's papers, I think, than anything else that I've ever seen. So I've definitely learned more than my fair share from Terry as well, and I've enjoyed seeing those papers come out. And I really like the COVID paper he sent me a little while ago too. So this is a pretty different kind of paper. So what I'm going to be trying to think through is a new type of policy instrument for controlling carbon emissions, and I'll basically give the talk in a different kind of way as well, where I'm going to spend the first chunk of it basically doing an overview of what I'm proposing, and then I'll stop and take questions and do some brief literature. And then depending on time and on interest, I can either go through it more formally or not. But I think that the idea is made pretty transparent by the time we get to that point. So one thing I'd love for everybody to keep in mind as I go through is I know that this is applicable to other settings, and I have one in particular in mind that I'll touch on at the very end. But no doubt several of you will think of settings that this kind of instrument could be applied to, and I'd be really curious to hear about them as they come to you. Also, if you know of related literature, I haven't found anything super closely related. I wouldn't be shocked if there was something in, say, fisheries or something that might be fairly closely related that I just don't know about. So if you did know of something, again, I'd be really curious to get that kind of feedback. So the basic problem, well, this isn't, I guess, a problem, is that there's a lot of momentum behind zero emission targets right now. So the UK passed a net zero emissions law just a handful of years ago, back in 2019, which I guess now it's actually 2021 somehow. France then, like the week after that, passed basically the same law. The EU basically passed the same law more or less just a year later. State of California has maybe not an entirely binding executive order to achieve carbon neutrality. The Biden administration is also thinking about zeroing out carbon emissions by the middle of the century. And a bunch of corporations are doing the same thing. Apple's vying for carbon neutrality, BP's doing this, a whole range of companies are making these pledges. They have different degrees of teeth and different degrees of meaning, but this is a concept in the air of like zeroing out emissions by the middle of the century. If we could zero out emissions, it's unlikely that stopping precisely at zero would be optimal. So there's not going to be a discontinuity in the cost of eliminating emissions at zero, because if we were to remove the last drop of emissions from the economy, the way we're going to do it is by basically emitting and sucking equivalent amounts of CO2 out of the air. So given that we're doing that anyway, there's no discontinuity in going to -1 emissions or -2 or -3. So this net zero goal is a good focal point, but it's probably not the strictly optimal focal point. In recognizing this, companies are also thinking about going carbon negative, not just net zero. So Microsoft's pledged to be carbon negative by 2030 and to actually suck all of their old emissions back out of the air by 2050. So making them basically net zero over the life of the company by 2050. Stripe has also basically pledged to purchase carbon removal or negative emissions at effectively any price, starting ASAP. And I think they've even already signed a few contracts by now. This is an article from August, and I think just a month or so ago, they signed some contracts. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, projects sort of what the world needs to do to hit different temperature targets that are enshrined in various international treaties. So one common focal point is that we shouldn't allow any more than 1.5 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial. I think we're going to be doing pretty well if we end up hitting that target. What would it take to hit that target? They project that we would need net negative emissions by about 2045 or 2050. So here, annual emissions across the planet are negative in this region in the last part of the century. Even to hit a 2 degrees Celsius target, we need to be having net negative emissions by 2075 or so, and then net negative for the rest of the century. It's really hard to hit these targets if you don't go negative, because we're too close already, and we're gonna have to pull old CO2 out of the air at some point, or violate the temperature target. So this is something that I think at least many economists are not super aware of, that there actually are a lot of ways of doing this. So there is a somewhat niche econ community and a very broad engineering community that studies this stuff in detail. So I'll briefly summarize a few of the ways that we can make this happen. So these subfigures, just to kind of orient you, the x-axis in each figure is an indicator of the scale of what you can hope to accomplish with the technology, and the y-axis is an indicator of the cost. So you want technologies to basically be in kind of this region on the bottom right, where they have big scope and low cost, and we'll see most boxes are not in the lower right. But so the first one's afforestation, reforestation, basically planting trees. You suck carbon out of the air. That's what trees do, is they feed on carbon. There's some amount of carbon you can eliminate that way. There are concerns about the durability of the carbon that's locked away in trees, but in theory, you could do that. Bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, again, basically growing crops or forest, burning them for power, and then capturing the emissions coming out of the power plant and putting them underground. So carbon capture, like you might apply to a coal plant, but apply to a power plant run on biomass, that means the carbon's coming from the air into a plant, out of smokestack, underground after you capture it. And this is the main ways that models project going net negative later in the century. Biochar is the idea of basically locking carbon away in the soil in a way that's thought to have a major co-benefit for soil fertility in tropical climates. Somewhat controversial, possibly low cost. Enhanced weathering, the ultimate sink for carbon in the atmosphere over long time horizons, is basically carbon binds to exposed surfaces of certain kinds of rocks, and then ultimately ends up forming things like limestone. You could speed up that process by crushing the right kinds of rocks. And the potential scope of that is enormous, because that is the long-term sink for carbon. And if we could just speed up that sink, that'd be really powerful. I'll finish and then I'll see Terry has a question. Direct air capture, basically industrial facilities that suck CO2 directly out of the air and do something with it, like store it underground. Typically, these are means of they have a chemical reagent that binds to CO2 flowing through the facility. Then you heat it up, you separate out the carbon and the reagent, pump the reagent back through, bind to more carbon, separate out more carbon, and accumulate carbon and put it underground. So these things might look like giant fly swatters or something that are up there for air to flow through. Ocean fertilization, if you basically fertilize the oceans, in theory, I think one leading one is with iron. Basically, you can enhance plankton growth. That plankton's sucking carbon out from the atmosphere. As it dies and falls to the ocean floor, basically it's locked away in the bottom of the ocean. And then there's other means of kind of enhancing soil carbon uptake as well that are lumped together in G. And Terry, you had a question?
So are the potential carbon removal numbers annual or total cumulative?
These are gigatons CO2 per year. So these are annual.
Per year, okay.
In this plot. Yeah, if it were cumulative, I think it'd be hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the scope for like direct air capture, that's just limited by how many facilities you could build. Like, so the scope for that is fairly unlimited, but things like afforestation, we're limited by land area. Same thing with growing crops or power plants and such like that. Others like the ocean uptake and the enhanced weathering, again, like that scope could be pretty dramatic if you could actually make it work well. So the engineer's imagination and to some extent ecologist's imaginations are running, I think, a bit ahead of where many economist imaginations have run. So the common recommendation for climate change is basically pricing emissions, and that's obviously a good first step. So the way that we could think about the common policy is that in 2021 we have a choice. You can emit and pay a tax, or you could, or in a cap and trade, you could pay a price for a permit. I'm going to be indifferent between which way you think about it. Or you could just not emit and do something like run on solar panels or use less dirty fuels by substituting for something else, whatever your other option might be. In 2050, the emissions from 2021 are still in the atmosphere. They're just sitting up there and they're effectively done as far as the policy is concerned. In 2050, people who are choosing to emit in 2050 can again pay the tax, get rid of their emissions, or by that time, they can do things like emit and simultaneously pay for air capture by building a facility and running it and suck their emission back out of the air. So they're putting one in the air and taking it back out, one for one. If this kind of technology is available, and these things we know we can do, like they're off-the-shelf technology, it's just a question of cost, then one would like there to also be the option in 2050 to not just leave the old carbon in the atmosphere, but actually also suck that back out. But with the tax, you've paid the whole penalty up front. There's no reason you're going to pull your 2021 emission out of the air in 2050 if you paid an upfront tax on it in 2021. There's no ongoing penalty. You basically, what you've effectively done is given the public your carbon and then the public storing it in the atmosphere and bearing the risk of either wanting to take it out and not being able to, or of just having to pay from public funds in order to take it back out. So what I'm going to be trying to think through is how to design a market mechanism to incentivize private actors to also make this choice while preserving the optimal emission incentives. And that's going to be the two-step I'm trying to do, is to keep the optimal emission incentives given by a tax while also giving the optimal removal incentives, the optimal cleanup incentives for carbon. Should cleanup be cheap enough to make it warranted, or should damages be extreme enough to make it warranted? So allowing it to adapt to whatever we learn about removal cost and damages. So the basic point is that an emission tax treats carbon like a flow pollutant, but carbon's actually a stock pollutant. So its harm flows not just from the actual flow of carbon to the atmosphere, but actually the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. And the first order, carbon effectively doesn't go anywhere on policy relevant timescales. Carbon from decades ago is basically all still up there in the atmosphere. So the way we commonly think about it is there's a supply curve for abatement, where at any given marginal cost of abatement, we can, at a low marginal cost of abatement, we get very little abatement. Abatement's emission reductions, as most of you probably know. So you get very little emission reductions at a low cost of abatement. At a very high marginal cost of abatement, you could in principle get 100+% emission reduction. If we had a tax at an intermediate range, then that tax is going to incentivize this much abatement, let's say 80% abatement. If we consider a really high tax, no matter how high we raise the tax above this point, we're just going to get 100% abatement, because firms have no incentive to pull old carbon out of the atmosphere. There's basically a discontinuity in the tax's incentives. The tax keeps providing additional incentives to remove more carbon up to the point at which there are no more emissions left. But once you don't have any more emissions left to pay a tax on, you don't have any incentive to do anything more. You're basically beyond a limit on what the tax can do. So a tax can't reach this region of the supply curve. It's kind of stuck in the 0 to 100% abatement range. We're nowhere near 100% today. So this is not binding in the near term. But if we were to try to limit warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, then this actually could be binding. And that's something that we need to be thinking through now, which is what I'm going to try to be doing. So the question is, how can we get negative emissions through a market-based policy? Clearly, with a tax, you could have governments directly subsidize carbon removal or just directly procure carbon removal. So the thought experiment here is, what if governments can't do that, or what if we don't want them to do that? So there's basically, in the reviews of carbon removal, if they talk about it at all, there's a line like at the end where they just mention that subsidies would be needed. And I think that's the default way people think about it. There is an analysis I just found from 2019 that's a really nice paper where they actually try to calculate the scale of that subsidization that'd be required. It's enormous. So it's way greater than the total emission tax revenue that plausibly be collected. So you're not just going to use emission tax revenue to do it, should it actually be necessary. And not only that, but like if you look at, if you tally up the numbers as a share of output in plausible trajectories like the IPCC recommends, the spending on carbon removal as a share of output exceeds spending on defense. To expect that governments are going to do that is maybe they would, but I don't know that that's the instrument we want to rely on. So the thought experiment is, what is a revenue neutral or maybe revenue positive way of incentivizing carbon removal using a market mechanism? And we'll see how far we can get by that. I also want to point out there's a big literature on the double dividend that thinks about the benefits of recycling the revenue raised from an emission tax or from auctioning permits and cap and trade, and thinks about the interaction with things like income taxes. These distortionary taxation concerns are more severe in this case of subsidizing carbon removal, because now we're not raising revenue. We actually need to raise revenue in order to fund carbon removal. So we don't have a revenue recycling benefit. We actually have to raise more revenue from other taxes that are distortionary. So any concerns about distortionary taxation for standard emission taxes go double for subsidizing carbon removal. Yeah, Terry?
So I guess I'm still trying to understand the distinction between those two options, I guess, because to me, intuitively, it makes sense that you could simply have the tax count as a negative subsidy or whatever that would be. So
Yep.
you subsidize. But in your world, you're going to be charging the firms in effect more upfront, so that there's money left over that the firms have put up front that can be spent on carbon removal later on if it turns out to be optimal or necessary?
Kind of. Let me come back to that and tell me how you would think about what I say.
Okay.
In the context of your question. There's a way in which we're charging them more upfront, but there's a way in which we're charging them the exact same amount. And I'll make that clear as I go through.
Okay, because I was thinking in the context of the double dividend conversation, if you're charging them more upfront, it's potentially more distortionary upfront. But I don't know. I don't know how it plays out.
Right. It's hard to think about, because what you're going to see is that they have to post a bond up front that's larger than the emission tax, but they receive something valuable in return, so that the net payment is just the emission tax. And so it's going to be hard to think about. I think you would actually want to write down a model, I think, for the double dividend and see what would happen. I think not a lot would happen, though, absent some sort of liquidity constraint, because the actual net payment is just the same amount as under an emission tax. Because the whole point is you want to preserve the right incentive to emit. If they're paying more upfront than under the emission tax, and you've distorted the first incentive to get emissions right. So if this policy is going to be attractive, then the emission incentive's got to be right. So their net payment still has to be the optimal emission tax. But I'd be curious to get more thoughts on that once I fully describe it, because it is tricky to think about, given that they do have a big payment, but the net effect, once you net out the valuable asset, isn't as large. I'd be curious if you have more thoughts on that at that point. So the basic question is, can we incentivize optimal carbon emission and removal without net outlays from the government? So like I said, a revenue neutral or revenue generating policy. I'll do some lit at the end, but the recommendation for Pigouvian taxes goes way back, like to the very earliest work on climate change. There's a huge literature on emission taxation, obviously. There's a huge literature on cap and trade, obviously. There's a lot of literature in the last, especially 5 to 10 years on negative emissions, and it's growing extremely rapidly. But I've seen very, very little to almost literally nothing about how to incentivize negative emissions. So this is trying to think about, okay, we could do this. Maybe we'll want to do this. What's a market-based mechanism to actually make this happen without the government just doing it directly? So one solution that should, I think, occur pretty quickly is we could just tax the stock of carbon instead of the flow of carbon into the atmosphere. So like I said, carbon's a stock pollutant. It's the accumulation of carbon that causes harm over time. So instead of taxing carbon as it's injected into the atmosphere, just say, well, hey, you firm X put carbon in the atmosphere some time ago. That's causing harm today. So pay the share of harm that's realized today. And that changes our previous picture, because now firms still have to decide between emitting and paying a tax, where this tax is basically the present value of all future charges they expect to pay. They're expecting to pay now and every future year that this stuff is in the atmosphere. And if they're forward looking, they'll do that calculation properly. And so they still decide between that and not emitting at all. But now come 2050, they can, if they leave their carbon in the atmosphere, they still pay a charge on it. And now there's a reason why they might want to do something like pay for air capture, because that means they avoid paying the charge. So a stock pollutant, a tax on the stock of carbon could directly solve the problem, and is sort of the cleanest thing one could do. But the problem is that we're looking at long time horizons. So we're thinking about possibly removing emissions that firms emit over the next decade and maybe removing them 30, 40, 50 years hence. The odds that all those firms are still in business and around to actually internalize that carbon charge in their old carbon, maybe some of them will be, but even those, like maybe they could shed it through bankruptcy. I have no idea. Like it seems like a pretty risky bet to count on firms that constitute a big enough chunk of emissions still hanging around at the time when negative emissions became warranted. So I think this judgment proofness problem is very severe. And it could even be worse than I'm describing because the bankruptcies could even be endogenous. If we ended up in a world where carbon removal were really attractive because damages look like they're really out of control, then we're cranking up the charges in CO2 in the atmosphere. The CO2 in the air is a pure liability for the firms it's attached to, and they have a real incentive to try to shed these liabilities through bankruptcy or something else, or just disappearing entirely, even if they're a firm that basically doesn't produce carbon intensive fuels anymore. So I think the clean solution of taxing the stock of carbon is challenged by the fact that firms may not survive over the super long timescales that we're possibly discussing. So we need an instrument that doesn't make the stock of carbon a liability that people want to shed and nobody else wants to pick up, but instead makes it something valuable that people want to hold. Because if we can make the stock of carbon something people want to hold, we don't need to worry about the fact that firms might go out of business, because if there's this valuable asset left behind them, then other investors will come in behind them to pick it up. So the policy that can do this that I'm proposing is what I'm calling carbon shares. And the idea is that there's an emitter who, at the time of emission, posts a bond to the government, to the regulator. So this is an upfront one-time payment attached to every unit of emission. That bond finances a new asset called a carbon share that's attached to that unit of emissions that was released at time t. The firm receives this asset, and I'll describe what happens to this asset over time, and then it can sell that on if it chooses to. So it receives something of value, and we'll define what that value is, in exchange for having posted this bond. What we'll see in a bit, going back to Terry's question, is that this bond is going to be a lot larger than the optimal emission tax, but they're going to receive this valuable thing in return. And so their incentive to reduce emissions and their net payment per unit of emissions is the bond minus the valuable asset, which at the optimum we'll see is just going to be equal to what the emission tax would have been. So the firm's basically going to be posting a lot of money, financing this new asset, and this asset's going to be something people want to hold. So what is the asset? I mean, that's where the work of the policy is actually happening. So let's fast forward to time t plus s. So these time t emissions are still hanging around in the atmosphere at time t plus s. Sorry, you have a question?
Well, I'm just curious, what would happen to the value of the asset if there's political risk that the government stops following through on this policy in the future?
Yeah, I want to defer that a little bit because I will explicitly address that, and I think my answer will make more sense once I've fully described it. But one thing I wasn't going to say then that I'll say now is that I think the political risk is actually less severe for an additional reason of this policy, because what you're doing is you're basically giving firms a property right. And because of the way legal systems are structured, it's typically hard for the government to renege on property rights. There's protections that are offered. I'll also describe the way the policy can actually be adjusted directly to mitigate political risk. But I think the fact that there's a property right underlying everything also offers kind of an additional backstop against anything too crazy happening. Because investors now hold a valuable asset, it can't just be directly taken from them because it's going to be subject to takings rules that constrain governments. I'm not a legal expert. I don't want to too much in that, but I'll have more to say on that later as we go through. The thing with all these climate policies, political risk is the thing, right? And like really, we're trying to shape long-term incentives for investment in technology and a new infrastructure. And so everybody's forward looking about the stream of future emission taxes and charges or cap and trade, whatever the policy might be. And finding a way to mitigate that, to me, is where a lot of research should be heading and targeting, because it's really critical. So I'll say something about it, which may be insufficient, but you can poke me about it when I get there. All right, so let's fast forward to time t plus s. So the time t emissions are still hanging around in the atmosphere. And I'm going to distinguish between the face value of the share, or key concepts can be the face value of the share, which is going to evolve over time. So at the very first instant, the face value of the share is just equal to the bond that was posted. So the firm posted a bond, and that bond becomes the face value at the first instant. And that's going to evolve over time. So what's going to happen in every period that the carbon remains in the atmosphere is that the regulator is going to charge for damages that have been realized from carbon, and I'll describe in a bit how that charge should be structured. But for now, there's just some payment that you have to make that's tied to climate damages. There's also some dividend that you're going to pay, which I'll define later. But for now, just abstractly, there's a dividend you pay to investors who hold the share. And then in the next instant, the remaining value of the bond is just whatever the incoming value was, minus the dividend payments, minus whatever charges were made in that instant, and then advanced by the rate of interest going into the following period. So the face value grows at the rate of interest, net of whatever is deducted in each period for dividends and for damage charges. And then we'll think about what those charges and dividends should be. The other possible future, though, is that the shareholder removes the carbon from the atmosphere at time t plus s. And then something different is going to happen. So the investor who holds the carbon share at time t plus s can contract for carbon removal, or could build it themselves if they want to. There's some cost they pay for carbon removal. Should they do that, they receive the entire remaining face value of the bond. So what's happening is that they're now treating the decision to remove carbon as exercising an option. They're basically solving a stopping problem. Once they choose to remove that unit of carbon, if they ever choose to, then they receive whatever the remaining face value of the bond is, and that basically that carbon share is gone. There's no more carbon left in the atmosphere attached to that carbon share. So if we think about the trade-off that they're doing, is that they're basically saying, well, what's my payoff for removing carbon? That's just the face value I receive minus the cost of removal, and I'm comparing that to the value of keeping the option open in the following period. And I'm deciding based on what I've seen about the damage charges, based on what I've seen about the cost of carbon removal, is it worth removing carbon at this instant or not? So we can think about it as being like an option whose value is related, whose underlying asset is worth the face value of the share, where the strike price of exercising the option is the cost of carbon removal. Here, the strike price is stochastic because we don't know future technology, but you could think about this all in terms of an option pricing framework. But basically, the key is that why would investors want to remove carbon? Because if they pay for carbon removal, they get the full face value. And by getting the face value, what they're doing is they're avoiding the future damage charges that would have been deducted at time t plus s plus 1 or time t plus s plus 2. They're heading off the regulator from deducting more and more from the asset, and they're keeping it all to themselves. So when do they want to remove carbon from the air? They want to do it when carbon is cheap, when the cost of removal is cheap, and when they expect high future damage charges, because we're in a high climate change world. And then if that combination of things is true, I can pay a little bit of money today to get the full face value. And by doing so, I avoid having the face value deducted really quickly by the high damage charges I see coming in the future. And I'll describe in the next slide what those damage charges should be. So for now, without talking about what the values of these things should be, does that basic picture make sense before I move on? All right, so what should the charge be? And this isn't just speculation. I mean, these are proofs in the paper, but in which I can come back to formally if there's interest in time. But it's pretty intuitive, I think, what happens. So what should the charge at time t plus s be for on time t emissions? It should be equal to the time t plus s portion of marginal damage from time t emissions. So if we think about what an emission tax is, the optimal emission tax is the present value of expected future marginal damage all the way out to time infinity, basically. We're basically exploding that present value into the strip of marginal damage that's realized period by period by period. And we're also kind of getting rid of the expected value by actually charging whatever really is realized, not just average marginal damage, but if we're in a low marginal damage world, you get a low charge. If we're in a high damage world, you get a high charge. So the policy is actually adapting to information as we go on but not just information for current emissions, but information relevant to past emissions as well. I think what's interesting is that there's a lot of work that's criticizing models for predicting emission taxes based on we don't have any idea what future damages are going to be. And there's a lot of work trying to empirically estimate those damages from the variation in weather and tying that to variation in climate change. And it's pretty controversial and maybe empirically hopeless to really nail what the future damages for climate change are going to be. Here it's a much smaller ask. We're just asking you to estimate damages in this year. We see this year's weather. There's a well-developed literature now in attribution studies by climate scientists that try to say how much more likely were weather events because of climate change. So this is actually something that maybe isn't going to be nailed empirically, but you can get pretty close to in a way we're not going to get close to future damages from climate change. So I think these charges could be tied to empirical work in a way that carbon tax just may never be all the way tied to it. And I'll come back to this and say a bit more about the future damages at the end. What should the bond be? So that should be the worst case social cost of carbon. As I said, the emission tax is basically the expected value of all future possible streams of marginal damage. The bond should be the worst possible version of those. And the idea is that the bond is basically defining the initial face value of the share. And we're going to deduct from that face value, we're going to deduct the damage charges in all future times from that face value. So we want to have enough face value to finance any possible sequence of charges. I'll do it, you might be concerned, well, maybe that's infinite. How large is this? I'll do a quantitative exercise near the end where I heuristically just sort of say, the bond should be about 20% of emission taxes we typically think about. But in theory, it should be literally the worst case social cost of carbon. Terry, you had a hand up or down?
Well, yeah, I guess I was kind of curious, why isn't it like uncertainty weighted? I mean, you're saying that the bond starts out as the worst case cost of social carbon. Why isn't it like the expected cost of social carbon or something like that? Since because presumably the market's going to adjust based on expectations of the future or something like that.
Yeah, so what's going to happen, and like really what's the bulk of analyzing the instrument is you have to figure out what is the actual value of the asset firms are receiving. And that means you have to solve the stopping problem and decide, based on when I would optimally choose to do carbon removal, what's my value of having this share today? And it turns out that the value of the carbon share is the expected, well, what's the right way to say this? Yeah, so the bond minus the carbon share, as I'll show in a little bit, is the expected marginal damage out to all future periods. So the value of the carbon share that the firms are receiving in return is basically taking out is subtracting uncertainty in just the right way that you're left with the expected future marginal damages as the net payment. So I think your intuition is that you don't want firms to pay for the worst case. You want them to pay for the expected marginal damage. And the bond they're posting is the worst case. But when you deduct the value of the carbon share they receive, what they are paying on net is going to be the worst case social cost of carbon. And I'll try to give a little intuition for that in a second.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, what they're paying on net is the expected social cost of carbon, not the worst case social cost of carbon.
So sorry to layer on questions. Yeah. The other question is, how worried are you about the requirement that you observe marginal damages? I understand there's some premise that you can empirically motivate it, but you have to have some like institutional mechanism where people agree that this is how we measure marginal damages.
Yeah, so I think this is a big issue. But I want to emphasize, I think this is less of an issue here than is for emission taxation. So if you want to think about emission taxation or cap and trade, you need an institution that's going to project marginal damages, not just in time T plus S, but in all future times beyond T plus S, and in every possible state of the world for all later times, and then take the expectation and present value of that and wrap it into an emission tax. Here, all the regulator has to do is they have to know the current portion of marginal damages, which you also need it for the emission tax. And they have to know one state of the world's marginal damage, which you also need it for the emission tax. So it's a subset of the information you need for the emission tax. However, the information doesn't go away. Somebody has to know that other stuff. And what we're doing, as I'll come back to at the end, is we're basically shoving a lot of that work onto private markets instead of onto the regulator. So now it's onto the private market to project expected marginal damages based on what they think future damage charges are going to be. And as I'll mention, what I think would happen is that the regulator is basically just looking at damage charges period by period by period. What you would expect to see is markets emerge where you would have futures and options and things like that on future damage charges. And then that would mean the private market is now doing a lot of the work of projecting future damages in a way the regulator doesn't actually have to. And if that were true, then Now you have incentives to become knowledgeable about climate change, to fund monitoring, to fund modeling, to do all these things that right now is the public sector doing it, because it all has to be done for the public sector policy. Here, the public policy is just year by year by year, and the market cares about knowing what future policy would be, but the regulator doesn't have to define that. It's up to the market to make their best guess about what's going to happen in the future. And to me, that's actually a big advantage. I think having price discovery on future damages happening through the market would not only improve our knowledge of damages, but it would also allow expectations to be coordinated around society in a way that can make it easier to do, let's say, lending around investments that would pay off only in certain kinds of climate policy worlds. We would have a common understanding of what policy is likely to be and how risky it might be to finance one kind of investment or another. So it's taking political risk, political and social and natural risk, everything is going to be wrapped up into the market for these, into the derivatives market on these damage charges. And the expectation of those charges would be revealed through that kind of market. At least you would expect that to emerge in equilibrium. I don't think it would be every firm on their own projecting damages, would be my guess. But I'll come back to that at the end. You might see that as a weakness, and I'd be curious to know if you do. But to me, that's actually one of the major advantages, is that we are making private markets now do this work instead of the government do this work of projecting damages.
Thanks.
Last, what should the dividend be? It turns out that's a little bit of a free parameter, but basically the way that you would return the value of the share as rapidly as possible to the investors is as time goes along, we're saying this is our time T plus S marginal damage, and we had a worst case marginal damage wrapped up in the initial bond, just refund the difference as we go along. So you're saying if we're far from the worst case, then investors are getting a big dividend as time goes along, and they're seeing few damage charges being pulled out. If we are in a worst case trajectory, they're getting very low dividends, and they're seeing high damage charges from period to period, and they have a high incentive to remove carbon. So what are the incentives? This is getting closer to some of Terry's questions. So the marginal cost of emissions is equal to the expected social cost of carbon. So I mean, that is the criterion for first best. That is what you can get with an emission tax. We would be disturbed and have trade-offs if we somehow lost that, but you actually do get that. And the intuition is what I said earlier, where they're posting a bond that's the worst case social cost of carbon, but they receive this thing of value in return. And as I might show you formally later, once you net that out, what's left is the expected social cost of carbon. You also get first best removal incentives. And I think this is intuitive. So if we think about why you would remove carbon, what are you really weighing? You're weighing what's the expected stream of damage charges into the future that I could recover by paying for carbon removal now. If I don't pay for carbon removal, I'm going to lose those damage charges as they arise. They're not going to come back to me as dividends. They're going to be lost from the face value of the share. But if I choose to pay for removal, then I'll get all those right now because the regulator will never pull them out of the face value. I'm going to recover the whole face value at this instant. So the decision that shareholders are making is what's the cost of removal on the one hand versus what's the expected stream of damage charges that they're saving by removing today. That's exactly what in first best you want to be thinking about when you make a removal decision. You want to remove carbon from the atmosphere if and only if doing so is justified by the future marginal damage you're avoiding by removing carbon. So they're making the right decision, assuming you set the damage charges in the way we've described, et cetera, et cetera. So that also means it's adaptable. So people are going to end up removing carbon if it turns out to be cheap to remove carbon, or if we turn out to be in a high damage trajectory. And if either of these things is not true, then maybe we won't end up doing removal. Like, we're not locked into removing. It'll depend on what's happening with the market in the natural world out into the future. And plus, we're going to get early market signals. So I would imagine that for the most part, damage charges will vary kind of smoothly, which will also give me a window into discussing political risk near the end. And so if you see charges are on a high trajectory, you're going to get a signal pretty early on that removal is going to look attractive, and markets will then have an incentive to invest in developing and financing these technologies. And if we're in a world with pretty low charges, then again, we're going to get a signal maybe it's not as worthwhile. And so I think, again, the sort of price discovery and early indicators of coming policy is a valuable aspect of this alternate design. When is it important to begin issuing shares? And it should hurry up so I can get at least through the objections part, which isn't that much longer. But so if we think about when it's valuable to have this policy instead of an emission tax, first, you want negative emissions to not be optimal for quite a while. So if we were in a world where we already wanted net negative emissions, there's no added value to a carbon share to starting a carbon share policy now, because we don't have any current emissions to attach a share to. Like, it's kind of too late. We want to have a lot of emissions that are still going into the air that could later be removed. So, that kind of fits with today's world to some extent. We also want to begin when current emission controls are relatively lax. And the reason is that the value of a carbon share policy, as opposed to an emission tax policy, derives from the possibility that you'll want to do negative emissions. The laxer our current emission controls, the greater our current emissions, the more likely you are to eventually want to pull emissions back out of the air, and the higher the value of actually starting a carbon share policy instead of just doing an emission tax. These two conditions kind of fit today's world, where emission controls are probably laxer than optimal, and negative emissions are not going to be optimal for a few decades at least. So that means that there actually is value in getting the policy sooner rather than later. If we wait too long, then we're closer to negative emissions, or we have more stringent emission controls already. Possible objections. So, Terry's basically hit on several of these. So, will paying the worst case social cost of carbon, posting the upfront bond, challenge liquidity? I again want to emphasize the net outlays are the optimal emission tax, which you don't usually think about as challenging liquidity, because firms do post a bond, but they receive something valuable in return that they could, in theory, directly sell on to investors in a market. And I'll quantify the size of that bond shortly in a numerical exercise. What about regulatory incentives? So this is the thing about leading to overly high damage charges. And I hope I have a call out about the opposite, about overly low charges, which is probably more what Terry had in mind from political risk. So there'll be lobbies for and against high charges. This is the point I really want to make. So you might be worried, based on US experience, if nothing else, and maybe Australian experience and many others, that policy can be pretty fickle over time, that climate policies can kind of come in and out and be strong and then be weak or even be non-existent. You could imagine in designing this, and so this is particularly severe with an emission tax, because you're loading the entire incentive directly at the time of emission. And if you have strong controls, then you strongly can limit emissions in a given period, but you could take those controls off and then have no controls in a subsequent period. You could imagine having a smoother policy environment with this one, where you could artificially, at the time of setting up the policy, constrain how quickly the charges are allowed to change over time. And you're going to lose something if it turns out that you learned something really quickly about climate change. Plausibly, in the absence of crossing the huge threshold in a given year, the damages are going to kind of evolve smoothly towards a high or low trajectory. Like, you're going to kind of learn incrementally that you're on a high or low trajectory. And so by constraining how quickly charges could change, you could plausibly constrain political influence while not losing too much in distortions in the optimal charge. You'd want to write down a model. You'd want to think through that. You'd want to think about how to avoid the constraints themselves being loosened. But I think there are mechanisms in this kind of policy that are not quite as available in an emission tax policy. You could do constraints and emission tax as well, but again, like, the incentives are not as smooth because it's all being loaded in emissions in a given period. It's not just going to be one slice of charges like we're seeing in this policy. Another objection which Terry also hit on is this informationally too demanding. Again, I want to emphasize that it may be informationally too demanding, but it's less demanding than conventional policies, because we don't need a probability distribution over marginal damage in every future period. We just need marginal damage today, which we needed for an emission tax, and we need the worst case in the future, which we also needed for an emission tax. So what we need is a subset of what's necessary for an emission tax. And I'll talk in a slide or two about where the rest of the information comes from. So hidden benefits. So one is, I think this policy would be really helpful for development of carbon removal technology. So first, by actually having the market funded through a revenue neutral market-based mechanism, you would establish a larger market for the technologies should damages warrant using them. And you would get an early signal that these technologies would be valuable, and that would trigger investment and financing and things like that. And possibly more importantly than what we're discussing earlier is that you're really taking the informational burden of projecting future damages out of the public realm and putting it on markets. you're also taking the risk of having to pay for removal out of the public realm and putting it back on markets. But as a side note, so markets will perform price discovery of future damage charges. Like I mentioned, the regulator doesn't need to know the distribution of all possible future damages, but somebody's got to know that, because firms have to think about what are future charges going to be when they choose to emit and when they choose to remove carbon attached to a share. So somebody's got to think about that. And that somebody's not the regulator, that somebody's going to be private markets. And now there's a real incentive to try to figure out these future damages from the market side. And I think that's a huge benefit. And we have no idea exactly how that would lead to things evolving differently. But I think things would evolve in some very different way than having all work done basically by academics and government regulators and maybe insurance companies. So private firms have to become educated. And you can imagine there being new monitoring and modeling systems that were funded, where firms are basically selling the services of having better forecasts of future damages. And that's now a valuable thing other firms need to know. So I think this is a knock-on benefit that's impossible to quantify, but to me is potentially really important. I've described this whole policy as being done through a price instrument, but we do see more cap and trade than emission taxes in the world. And I don't think it's incompatible with cap and trade. So instead of announcing damage charges period by period, we would just have the regulator announce a cap on cumulative emissions period by period. The regulator would basically accept bids about where shareholders would remove underlying units of carbon, and it would equate these bids. It would find the market clearing charges by equating these bids to the cumulative emissions that it actually allows. What it doesn't do is it still requires the worst case social cost of carbon to be specified as a price instrument. I haven't thought of a good way to do that through a quantity instrument, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be done or it's not worth thinking through. So quantitative questions. So this will be fairly quick, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I think the two things one might wonder are, one is how large is the bond? Like, do you need an infinite bond? And two, how important is this policy tweak? Are the gains actually significant relative to doing an emission tax? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a recent version of Nordhaus's DICE model, which couples the climate and the economy, and I'm going to extend it to allow uncertainty and learning about damages. I've converted it to MATLAB, which anybody can download. I'm using it in my course right now, and I found it really helpful for that. So you're welcome to use this GitHub MATLAB code, and definitely if you find an error or anything, definitely shoot me a line and I'll fix it. The main tweak so in the model, output is reduced multiplicatively by damages that are related to the level of warming. So the greater warming is, the greater the loss in output from climate change. And D is a coefficient controlling how important temperature change is for output. So we know very little about damages. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow D to be uncertain. And just for this kind of stylized analysis, I'll presume that we know D for 50 years. And then we have a distribution over D for all years beyond that. In 2065, we're going to learn the true value of D, and we can adapt policy accordingly based on whether we're in a high or low damage world. And I'm going to use the expert survey from Bob Pendyke's paper to calibrate a distribution for damages. And then in one version, I'll take the mean from the expert survey, which implies fairly high damages. And another version, I'll fix the mean and distribution to DICE's damages, which is a much lower damage calibration. But the variance of damages is coming from the survey. That's kind of the key thing. All right, so what I'm plotting here is basically I'm sampling over all possible streams, over all possible realizations of the damage parameter with policy optimized in every scenario. So policy is optimized prior to 2065, knowing that you don't know damages, but will know them. And then after 2065 is optimized based on whatever you learned. And then I'm saying, given all the things that could happen, under what percent of the outcomes, which is the x-axis, is the bond on the y-axis large enough to actually fund the stream of damage charges that are optimal? And so what we see is with DICE damages, which are fairly low damages, a bond of about $100 per ton of carbon dioxide it can cover outcomes in like 98% of cases. Maybe the very highest damage worlds aren't covered, but almost every world is covered. That comes out to something like, I forget, maybe 10 cents a gallon of gasoline. So it's not an enormous charge. Expert damages, you need a much higher bond because the mean damages are higher. But if you're up to around $300, $400 a ton of carbon dioxide, which is lower than some emission tax recommendations, although it's still on the high end, you can cover charges in 95+% of the cases. So you can be well short of infinite and still cover the charges in a lot of cases. What's nicer, I think, is to think about the value of the bond not as dollars per ton of carbon, but relative to the emission tax. And there you see the distribution we use doesn't matter that much. It doesn't matter whether you think we're in this high damage expert calibrated world or the low damage dice world. Either way, by the time you get to a bond that's about 200% of the 2015 emission tax, so twice as large as the initially optimal emission tax, then you're covering damages in over 90% of cases. So my rough rule of thumb is a bond of twice as large an emission tax, because it's a unit people understand, is sufficient typically. And by the time you're up to 3 or 4 times as large, like you're clearly almost always fine, unless you're in a really terrible world. What's the welfare?
Derek, can I ask a question? But it seems like that isn't that where you're kind of your claim that you want to set the bond to the worst case social cost of carbon. There, people can always argue that the worst case is infinite or crazy or whatever. So how do you not set it to the worst case? You set it at the 98th percentile or something, or?
Yeah, I think in practice, if we're using a distribution with infinite support, the worst case is going to be infinite. And so in practice, we're going to have to pick a number. So if you're in, let's say you set the charge here and you're in like this little bit of world to the right, where like in this 5% of cases where you don't have enough to cover it. Let's be clear, it's not that you can't cover negative emissions. You're still going to get a big chunk of negative emissions. You're just not going to get every last drop that would have been optimal. So it's still a heck of a lot better than emission tax. And the loss from maybe not getting you're in a world would be really valuable to get the very last drops. And so you can't do it, which is unfortunate. Ideally, either you've got the chunk of it and it's okay, or the government could fund the last chunk, or you just forget about it. But either way, you've probably got the bulk of the welfare gains, because you still, it's not like you're not covering anything. It's just you're hitting a constraint at some point, whatever's left in the instrument. But you're right. Technically, with any sort of normal distribution like I have over damages, you're going to end up needing to get an infinite bond if you want to truly get the worst case. So there's going to be some trade-off that a policymaker would have to figure out. So failing to incentivize negative emissions, is that actually critical? So what I'm going to do is I run DICE 2 ways, one in which it's constrained from ever having negative emissions, and another in which it allows negative emissions after 2065. And then I compare welfare between the two cases, assuming everything else is optimized properly. And so the first I want to point out that the gains as a fraction of sort of constant consumption trajectories are enormous under optimal policy when damages are really high. We're looking at a 40% adder to consumption, and they're fairly small under DICE damages, 1.5% of consumption benefit. If you can't have negative emissions, the benefits fall to about 37.5% or about 1.4%. Either way, the loss as a fraction of what you could have gained is about 7 to 9%. So it'd be roughly you're increasing the value of climate policy by 7 to 9% if you can use a carbon share policy instead of an emission tax policy. So maybe not super critical, but helpful. And these gains are concentrated in really bad states of the world, right? They're concentrated in worlds with really high damages. And if I were to allow uncertainty about the cost of removal, you can imagine these gains getting bigger, because now there's actually, then in that case, there'd be a lot of states of the world really cheap removal that a share policy could access, but an emission tax policy couldn't. But heuristically, I'd say up to 10% of benefits could, or the value of policy could go up by 10% or so. I want to briefly touch on related literature. That'll take like a minute or two, but I'm happy to stop and take any questions before I finish with 1 or 2 slides, if you have any.
Any questions?
Going once, going twice.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm not quite sure where to start on this, because it's somewhat outside the scope of my. I really like this.
Okay, thank you. I like the questions so far.
Yeah, I know, it's really easy, right? It seems like you already touched on a lot of this, but I think I missed some of it. But who's in charge of verifying the damages? And I think this is going back to what you were modeling. Who's finding the true value of D? I think those are the same question.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So there, Here, it's different from an emission tax in that you can think about needing to know two kinds of D. One is you need to know today's D, and you also need to know D in the future. An emission tax, you have to know, the regulator has to know both of them. Here, the regulator has to figure out today's D, and the private markets have to figure out the future D, because firms need to know what damage charges they would expect to be losing out into the future, or shareholders need to know the damage charges they would expect to lose in the future. That plays out because that affects the equilibrium value of the share. If those damage charges are going to be high, the value of the share is low, and vice versa. So the value of the share is going to incorporate that, and shareholders have an incentive to figure out those expected charges. But all the regulator has to know is today's D, and as long as they do that calculation properly year by year by year, that's what investors are trying to project by projecting future D.
My concern on that is that there's more, it feels like there's more, the determination of today's D is more like it's because it's unverifiable.
Yeah.
And it's not ultimately observable. It hinges on the rule and mechanism used by the regulator as much as it does on what damages turn out to be. So forecasting the future hinges as much on being able to anticipate how future regulators will interpret future information to quantify damages as it does on the trajectory of climate change, which feels like a brittle piece of it, like, or a worrisome piece where you're going to have people, I mean, you could have room for like corruption and other things where people are.
I'm wondering sort of along those lines, I think, is there an equilibrium where the firms all get together and project future damages at zero? They set the discount rate really high or something.
Well, I mean, in the competitive market, there should be, I mean, this just come down to like, why is any asset priced properly? I mean, there should be forces pushing toward the asset to be properly valued, unless you're thinking about the regulator's response as being endogenous to this having happened. But then that goes then to Terry's point, like basically, like, is this policy brittle because the regulator might not do the right thing? And yeah, I think that's a risk with any climate policy. Like, we're always trying to price something, which is the social cost of emissions that is not priced in the market. And you have to have the regulator do that somehow or other. And I guess my question for you would be like, is there a reason why you see this as less brittle than an emission tax? There's actually one less degree of freedom for the regulator because they actually are tied to observable things and like what is happening now, and not just tied to anything that they could imagine might happen in the future for an emission tax.
So my answer to that would be that I feel like with an emission tax, you only need to know future marginal damages insofar as you want to set the current tax equal to the optimal Pigouvian tax or something, but you don't actually need it to implement the policy. So you can set the tax at $10 or $20 or $50 arbitrarily, and you still generate incentives, and the policy is what it is. Whereas in your case, the actual incentives for the policy and the way in which it play out all internally hinges on the future evaluation of these marginal damages.
So your concern is about the upfront incentive, that if I project that future regulators are going to misbehave, then the upfront incentive is going to be too weak, in the same way that it'd be too weak if I projected that I might be bankrupt or something.
Or too weak or too strong, but they're, or maybe hard to predict or hard to know.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that is what's different about this versus emission tax. Emission tax, everything does get internalized at the first instant in an upfront payment. You don't have to worry about any of these projections. You have to worry about projecting future emission taxes for long-lived investment, which is a similar problem. But you don't have to worry about this unit of emissions actually being priced properly. You know, firms are paying the full price. It's about whether the regulator is actually pricing it properly for the firms.
Right.
It's different. I agree. I agree. It's still not obvious to me that it's worse, but it is a different kind of risk in the way it would play out. Like, you have to, in this case, you have to think about the market projecting whether future regulators are going to behave properly, and the risk that they behave too extreme in either direction versus that they act optimally or whatever else might happen. And it's going to be an interesting equilibrium behind that. Versus an emission tax, you have to think about the regulator from year to year actually changing what it does in a way that kind of fully backs into the current value of emissions in like a more direct manner. I don't know. I think it's smoother, the problem, than with an emission tax, but it may be worse in the sense that you don't ever get the guaranteed reduction. So I don't know. It's complicated. Yeah, I think it's a good question. if you have further thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them because I agree. I think it's complicated. And I think without writing down a model and doing some sort of evaluation, it's really hard to say anything more concrete than that.
Derek, one question. Does the value of the asset, so suppose you don't remove the carbon from the atmosphere, right? So you're saying as damages increase, the value of the asset's going down, right?
Yep.
So does it just go to zero or does it ever go negative?
Oh yeah, thank you. This is what I didn't mention. It's a key intuition. So in equilibrium, the value of the asset is the expected future stream of dividends. So those dividends are refunding the difference between the worst case and the realized marginal damage. And this is why when they post a worst case bond and subtract off the value of the asset, they're left with the expected marginal damage as kind of their net payment. The constraint that I impose is that the value of the bond or the value of the asset has to go to zero in the limit, that you can't just hold on to the value of the asset forever. You've either got to pull it out as charges or return it to the investors as time goes to infinity.
Got it.
And the fact that it can't go negative is why you need to have a bond big enough to finance the worst case charges.
Yeah. I mean, so this is really, I like that you're thinking beyond just a carbon tax, right? I like that you're thinking about pulling the carbon from the atmosphere and incentivizing that somehow, because I think you're right. I haven't seen much on that in the literature. But is this any more feasible than a carbon tax? Because we haven't gotten a carbon tax through, right? I see it as potentially more feasible because you're creating some kind of positive incentive, right? You're giving them firms an asset, but you're also still taxing them.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I've thought about this too, and I really don't know the answer. I could tell stories either way. The other thing, which would be nice to actually write down a model for, is thinking about the international aspect of it, like whether the game theoretic properties are fundamentally different from carbon tax or cap and trade in the traditional sense. And I really have no idea without thinking about it more deeply.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem.
Yeah, it could really go either way. I have no idea. It could even be identical. I really have no idea.
I have to run to another meeting, but I really appreciate you presenting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions and thanks for coming.
Bye.
And one thing I'll mention on the way out is that there are other applications. So for instance, with orbital debris, it's the same problem of controlling the optimal creation of orbital debris and the optimal removal of debris. And the exact same kind of policy instrument can be applied in that context. And if you have ideas for other contexts, I'd be super curious to hear them.
I have a question, Derek. It's Simon here. Do you have a study of the implementation of whether it's bond or the carbon tax in the developing countries? Which one is, because I came from a country that's still kind of reluctant to use the carbon tax in this case.
And so you're asking me whether the political feasibility we
exactly, yeah.
You know, I'm not a political scientist or a political economist, so like I'm really, this is kind of similar to Jesse's question about what's more politically feasible. I could speculate and I could make stuff up, but I don't really have anything super not obvious to say about it, I don't think.
Okay.
But isn't it weakly less politically feasible, since the cost to the firm up front is at least as large as under the emission tax if it's set optimally?
If you expect it to be set optimally, it should be identical to the emission tax charge up front.
But that's predicated on the financial market being perfectly forward-looking and appropriately internalizing those things. Like I could imagine imperfections in financial markets or lack of trust in measurement of future damages or other things, or gaming of the system, or things causing people to be more skeptical of this kind of instrument and therefore perceive it as a higher cost. Or
yeah, I think I see where you're going. So before you were going down the lines of what if financial markets work really well and anticipate that regulators won't work really well. And now we're thinking about regulators working really well, but financial markets not working really well. So like a developing country with an enlightened regulator, but a financial market that is challenged with liquidity or something like that, where you really can't sell your asset once you receive it. In that case, yeah, then firms could be challenged by a liquidity constraint because they're posting a big bond, but receiving something that in theory has value, but they can't capture the value from it by selling it to an investor. And then, yeah, you would imagine this is weakly dominated by an emission tax from their perspective. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know that I would expect the regulators to behave that much better in that context. I think I'd want to allow both parameters to vary, and then I don't know how to think about it at all in that case.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I really like, I like the idea of your property right argument, that you have more incentive if you're giving out a property right, there's more incentive to say political risk is lower or whatever the benefit would be. I'm worried about the non-observability of damages and the need for financial markets to work in a way that might be unrealistic. But I think that the general idea is super cool.
Yeah. So what could I do to address your worries? Are they worries that could be addressed, or they just?
Well, I think, I mean, one question is there just a simple, like, do you define the damage rule? So I mean, something that would be verifiable. You could say, you could have a rule up front that says, and maybe it's tethered, you don't observe current year damages, but you observe last year's damages or something. There's some lag or whatever, but you observe temperature. So maybe it's damages are a deterministic function of temperature. So I observe the temperature realization across a bunch of places, or you observe precipitation, or you observe whatever, and you actually, but I think when you go down that path, you're going to realize that there's a lot of complexity in how you actually implement this kind of thing. But that at least would remove the uncertainty of agents in the model, you know, having it be unspecified,
right,
strikes me as worrisome.
And so what that would do then is that would basically, and if we think about how it adapts to uncertainty, it may not include economic uncertainty about what does temperature mean for the economy, but it would be adapting to uncertainty about how much warming are we going to get for any emission trajectory. That's
right. Or if there's anything observable that's correlated with economic damages from climate change. Like you could have, I don't know, agricultural impacts or something that you can actually, or sea level rise could be an option, you know.
Integrated hurricane power or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's a nice line of thought to go down. I mean, that is to me like one of the biggest questions right now for climate economists, like what are the damages from climate change? And I really am not thrilled with the way that's been handled empirically. And so thinking about these kinds of things that you could do more on a year by year basis is really valuable.
Right. I had another thought, but I can't remember it.
Thanks. I have to leave too. Thanks so much, Derek. That was super interesting. I have the paper right here, and if I can find certainly not flaws, but interesting things to add, then I will let you know.
Both are welcome. So thank you for attending and for.
It was very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefan. Great to see you.
All right. Take care.
Good to meet you too.
Sorry, I had a thought and I lost it. I was trying to think what one other thought I had was you assume that the cost of carbon removal is strictly convex in carbon removal. But I would have actually thought that there would be scale benefits. So I would actually expect it to be strictly concave. And if it were strictly concave, you'd end up with a non-convex optimization problem probably, and you could get scale effects. Which I can imagine being an important part of carbon removal. I mean, I think that opens a whole can of worms that you don't want to do in your main paper. But the question of like, are there scale effects where you need to do a fair amount of it for it to become worthwhile?
Right. Yeah. So the way I would think of, I would agree with you that like over some initial range that there would be a non-convexity for the reasons you gave. I would think by the time we're getting up to like significant carbon removal, like we're discussing, so my prototypical application I'm thinking of is these industrial facilities. And there I would think if we're really capturing like gigatons of carbon or anything close to a gigaton, it's really about building a whole bunch of facilities rather than about like one giant one. And so I would think that we're going to be getting closer to not only constant returns, but diminishing returns based on the right locations with the right wind and things like that, and the right
see.
storage facilities near them.
Okay.
You have to both be able to get good CO2 out of the air and then put it underground somewhere that's accessible and safely stored, et cetera. And those sites are finite. But over some initial range, for sure, like you would think that having a bigger facility is going to lower cost.
Yeah,
And it may be
the
more
storage
true
thing.
something like ocean fertilization, right? Ocean fertilization, maybe you really do get the kind of effects that you're thinking of.
Cool. I guess I was more thinking of the removal part than the storage, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's all going to be part of the cost is kind of the problem, I think.
Right. Yeah.
But so you were thinking if you had like one giant removal facility, basically, that would be cheaper than having like a bunch of medium-sized ones.
Yeah, or just that the industry will mature if it's bigger.
Yep. Right, because you're talking about an aggregate level, right? Yeah, I agree with you that this is definitely possible, and I agree with you that I think I don't want to go down this line.
Definitely.
I think you suggested I don't want to.
I did. Yeah, I don't suggest it. But I think it's the kind of problem where there could be interesting economic questions related to possible scale effects, but maybe not if you have the storage thing, because I think you're absolutely right that it's like the marginal extraction cost of fossil fuel. You're gonna do the cheaper storage options first, presumably.
That's right.
Yeah, cool. Well, it's super interesting. It's a great kind of excursion in a new direction that I think is promising, and I really appreciate your presenting it.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for all the comments. That was a great discussion. So I really appreciate all the comments. And this question about the future regulators, I mean, yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I've thought about to what extent I should actually model that or write that down versus just kind of like define the policy and leave that to be figured out.
I feel like at a minimum, just keep it simple and say we observe mean temperature in a year.
Yeah.
Make it assume the DICE model. I mean, I guess that's the question. So you're basically abstracting from economic damage uncertainty and just looking at the uncertainty, the temperature part of uncertainty, but you observe that. So that is verifiable.
Yep. And it implicitly always takes advantage of the technology uncertainty too. So I mean, the market's not going to handle the uncertainty about carbon removal costs. So you are always getting that side of the coin automatically for kind of for free as well.
Yeah, but I guess the problem with that then, of course, is you're not really getting it at marginal economic damages, or you have to take a stand at the beginning of the policy. But you could imagine a world where you reevaluate this every 5 years.
Yes.
And it's sort of like right now, this is our best estimate of marginal damages, and that's the thing we're committing to. And so any shares issued in the next 5 years will part of the definition of the share is the damage function the economic damage function that you're assuming.
Yep.
And then 5 years later, you issue shares under a new set of assumptions.
Yep.
And I don't know. So then you're missing out on the fact that you could get massive revisions to damage estimates in the future. Right. Though the good news is, I think the revisions on the cost side won't be affected by this limitation, because if it turns out that carbon removal becomes super cheap in the future, that's going to still enter the private incentives of firms who own the bonds.
That's right. Yeah, you'll still always be capturing the climate uncertainty and the carbon removal cost uncertainty, and you're just limiting how much of the damage uncertainty you can capture.
Right.
Or not even damage, but the economic aspect of the damage uncertainty you would capture. Right. Yeah, that's nice. I like that. And by committing to a D and by tying a D to a share, you do lose some of the updating benefits, but you do gain some of these credibility benefits. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like inflation protected securities. It's got a similar feel to that.
Right. Yeah, because I feel like that was in listening to you talk, I was sort of having alarm bells go off about like, well, how do we observe this and how do we verify it and what does that mean? And I would feel more comfortable having a feeling that, okay, that it's credible, that you can, you define it, you do have to define everything in the contract up front when you issue the share. I feel like it has to be cleanly defined or it's a problem. But if it's just temperature that's uncertain, and otherwise you take a stand on the economic damage function at the time of issuance, then it feels like there's no remaining uncertainty.
Right, and to be clear, like you can contract on decisions made by decision-making body, like there are these derivatives on the federal funds rate, and the contract specifies that whatever is announced by this board on these days is how these instruments are going to pay out, and they're successfully priced by markets. Like you can buy futures and options in the federal funds rate.
Yeah, the only problem is that in the case of climate damages, I mean, you're gonna have economists who say it's all over the map. So then you have to be clear about, I mean, how do you add up climate damages across the entire world?
Right. Yeah.
Have it be it could be any deterministic function of temperature, but you define it at the time of issuance.
Yeah. No, I like that idea. I do like that idea. I think this is worth a much longer discussion in the paper. I like that idea a lot. And then you're reducing what fluctuates within a share's life is just whatever things that are directly observable in the world. And there are things we might have gotten wrong at the time of issuance, but we're at least committed to them and fixed to them. And there's a benefit and a cost to that. It's a trade-off. Like, I mean, we think about these rules versus discretion trade-offs and the Federal Reserve and central banking all the time. Like when is it better to tie your hands versus have discretion? It's the same kind of trade-off.
Right.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful.
Yeah, well, and I feel like the most arguably the most, I mean, particularly there's just tons of, it's also uncertainty going forward about what are, you know, it compounds, like just uncertainty about where temperatures going is one thing, but uncertainty about how to economic damages evolve over time, over the next 100 years, et cetera. Whereas the cool thing is that the private incentives, like that marginal decision, the decision of your agent in the future, they see the price of the removal technology in a given date, and they're comparing that to the remaining bond price or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that uncertainty is fully captured, even if you constrain the rest of it.
Right. Even if the shares didn't adapt to any new information about the climate system or the economy, they are at least, the incentives are at least adapting to whether removal got cheap or expensive. At a bare minimum, you always get that benefit.
Right. The other question I kind of had was, I mean, it feels like you know, at the very beginning, I'm thinking, well, why not? And you jumped into this, you know, of course you could just have the tax be interpreted as a negative subsidy, or the negative tax is the subsidy or whatever. You can always subsidize removal. It would be nice to me to know what's the benefit quantitatively of having this more complex instrument compared to a simple situation where you're, say you have, although I guess it's really about, you're worried about paying for the future removal up front.
I don't know what you mean by worried, but I'm worried that if we didn't have an instrument like this and future removal became attractive because the cost of not removing were really high, that the cost of undertaking that removal, that basically a standard policy is shifting the risk of needing to remove emissions onto the public. And I'm worried that those costs could be large enough that the public wouldn't undertake them should it be attractive at the time.
Although just as in any other climate model, if you assume that there's, you know, if it's a time consistent model and the future is going to behave optimally, just like we behave optimally. So they're going to solve for the correct forward-looking model, given the comparison of the cost of the subsidy against the avoided future marginal damages. You're assuming that implicitly anyway in all other periods. So you could have the future doing the same thing where they're using the optimal subsidy in the future, given the continuation damages weighed against the cost. I mean, it would be interesting quantitatively, is there a benefit to the more complex instrument relative to that
You could
optimum?
basically put like a cost of funds or something into the subsidization, and just see how does the welfare gain change with different degrees of distaste for subsidizing or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, because something like what you're saying is already in that no negative emissions calculation. Because like in the no negative emission ones, the emission tax is initially higher because the policymaker anticipates that they can't take carbon back out of the atmosphere. So that caps the welfare benefit a little bit.
right.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea.
By the way, Simon, who was asking a question there, Simon, are you still there?
Yes.
Simon's one of my students, so just wanted to.
All right, good to meet you. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
Any other questions, Simon?
Probably.
Good. I should run and eat something real quick before I have to start.
Yeah,
my-
absolutely. Well, I really appreciate it. Sorry to keep you so long, but
No,
thank you so
this
much,
is
Derek.
great. This is why we do these things, right? To get these kind of comments. So I really appreciate it. So thanks for the discussion.
Agreed. Thanks
Yep,
so
and
much.
If any more comes to you, feel free to shoot.
I
me a line.
didn't invite applause in time for there to be a meaningful number of people left, but thank you so much. That was great.
That's totally fine. Thanks. Really appreciate you having me out. It's good to see you.
Likewise. Take care. Good luck with everything.